Vayomer Yosef el achav, kshuna alai, vayigashu. Vayomer ani Yosef achichem, asher mekartem oti mitzrayma. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." And they came close. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, who you sold into Egypt. Now, don't be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me here. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you." In this parsha, Vayigash, which plays on that word to draw close, we see the dramatic climax of Joseph's narrative. After all that has befallen Joseph, will he see success? Will he reunite with his family? Will the children of Israel avert climate disaster and global crisis to find safety in an adopted nation where they will have enough to eat? The answers to all of these questions is a resounding yes. While perfectly imperfect, not suggesting that the harm that was done to Joseph would be magically undone, Parshat Vayigash delivers the happy ending we didn't know if Joseph would find. The closure is exquisite, and we're set up perfectly for the next chapter, the next book, as a matter of fact, the book of Exodus, when the next great challenge faces the children of Israel. But as I read Parshat Vayigash this year, I am struck by such personal connection that I actually struggled to put together the words to share the experience with all of you. It is not my story that I see in Joseph's narrative, but the story of a young man whose life has intersected with mine. A story I have piece by piece been sharing with more and more of you. This is the story of a young man in this generation, a young traveler who encounters a world far from his own, which he moves to adopt, learning from his experience in new ways that follow him throughout his life and seeking unification for his family in a new land. Some of you may already know this, but for years, my husband, David, was a summer camp counselor at Seeds of Peace in Maine. Seeds is a beautiful vision which brings Israeli and Palestinian children to neutral ground on a lake shore in Maine and has them actually talk to each other. The program has expanded mightily over decades and began to bring in campers from many conflict-torn regions all over the world: India and Pakistan, the Balkans, Afghanistan, and even recently resettled Somali immigrants to Maine and multi-generational residents of those same towns. In the year 2008, David had a 13-year-old camper in his bunk named Shapur, who came as part of a delegation from Kabul, Afghanistan. Shapur was a kid full of sweetness and laughter. David would describe how he would look at the lake in awe, as bodies of water such as this were completely new to him when compared with the urban landscape of Kabul. He would whisper, "How beautiful it is." David cried when he brought Shapur to the airport the week that he returned to Afghanistan. In the years that have passed, David and Shapur have kept in touch. Shapur grew up. He's a young man now, married, still living in Kabul, and using his language and his communication skills as a data scientist. In August of this year, as American troops counted down to their full withdrawal from Afghanistan, David received a panicked message from Shapur. Kabul had already fallen to the Taliban, and he didn't know who else to ask. He and his family couldn't escape by land through Pakistan, and bombs were going off at the airport. Please, was there any way that David could help? I think of Joseph, thrown in a pit by those he trusted. I think about the chapters of his story where every door was closed to him. I think of the wells he dug deep within himself, his dreams he refused to forget, his talents he put to any use just to find a way forward. We went into overdrive. We called everyone we knew. David was ringing contacts from Seeds of Peace. I panically called Rabbi Kleinbaum and Noemi Maslia and Tanya Domi, who I will never be able to thank enough for talking us through this first chapter. There were practically no options. The news was full of Afghans who had risked their lives for US armed forces, who had invested in creating democratic infrastructure, girls who had simply attended school, all of whom were being left behind in desperation, with no knowledge of what life under the Taliban would mean for them, or how long they might live inside it. The single pathway that was available to us was in the form of a plea to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services for a visa for expedited humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole allows an individual who has a compelling emergency and an urgent humanitarian reason allowance to enter the United States temporarily, and more importantly, a visa to leave their country of origin. Once in the US, Afghans are eligible to apply for refugee status and 2 years of residence in order to process immigration and citizenship filing. But first, you have to get out of Afghanistan. We reached back to Shapur with this information, offering that we would personally act as his sponsors. He wondered if we might find others willing to sponsor the immediate members of his family, his brother and his baby niece, who had already been served with a death threat from the Taliban for acting as part of the traitorous Kabul civic government, his elderly parents, all of whom have fled their homes and are in hiding. We connected with Seeds of Peace to try to find additional alumni who could serve as sponsors, only to discover that 250 Afghan Seeds and their families were now reaching out to every thread that they could grasp to find someone to serve as their humanitarian parole sponsors. Seeds had helpful advice, but very little bandwidth and overwhelming need. And so we turned to CBST. We barreled through hundreds of pages of documentation that accompanied the 2 slender forms that represent the entirety of a humanitarian parole request, approving financial fitness as sponsors and documenting the credibility of the threats that face Shapur and his wife as former Seeds. I am endlessly grateful to Rabbi James and to Noah Habib, especially the coordinator of our ARC immigration clinic here at CBST, both of whom sprang into action and acquired the expertise on the go to support us. Noah himself personally stepped up to sponsor a member of Shapur's family, which is not part of his job description. Rabbi James and Noah led a webinar that many of you attended with guidance from the Masliah firm about what it means and how to serve as a sponsor on a humanitarian parole visa. Incredible CBST members and CBST rabbis, members like Harold Levine, who's here tonight, have stepped up for each member of Shapur's family to submit these applications and to financially support the application fee of $575 per member per household, all payable directly to USCIS. I think of the life that Joseph was able to create for himself in Egypt. After no small number of setbacks and trials, he is able to rise and even act as leader and savior to his adopted country, who recognizes the gifts he has to offer. In one of the earliest models of an immigration story, in every literal sense a diaspora Jew, Joseph creates a life and a family for himself in Egypt. Would that this be the way that Shapur's story could end too. On Monday this week, we received devastating news. After months where over 40,000 applications for humanitarian parole received by USCIS have been stuck in limbo, the vast majority of these on behalf of Afghan nationals with credible threats against their lives, we are seeing a sky-high wave of outright denials. A new and much higher evidentiary standard has been put into place and is being retroactively applied to these tens of thousands of pending applicants who are in the midst of a humanitarian crisis. It insists on documentation from a credible third-party source, specifically naming the beneficiary and outlining the serious harm they faced and the imminence of said harm, akin to asking these Afghans who fear for their lives to come up with a notarized statement from their persecutor. And all the while, as a result of these 40,000 applications, USCIS has collected more than $17,250,000 in filing fees. As a beloved advisor put it to us, our ugly immigration history is repeating itself once again. This is a bureaucratic version of the voyage of the St. Louis, the infamous and heartless turnaround of an ocean liner carrying almost 1,000 German Jewish refugees seeking safe haven during the Holocaust. V'hakol nishmat bet paro lemor, ba'u achei Yosef, vayitav be'enei paro, uve'enei avadav. The news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph's brothers have come. Pharaoh and his courtiers were pleased, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do as follows. Load up your beast, go at once to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your households, come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will live off the fullness of our land." This Shabbat Vayigash, which happens to be Human Rights Shabbat, the anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Human Rights by the UN, enshrining basic human rights for all people, including the freedom of movement, thought, religion, and protection against harm and torture. In this week's Torah portion, we see an unbelievably progressive policy towards the welcome of refugee and migrants, and it comes from the Pharaoh of Egypt. This is the Pharaoh who knows Joseph, who has trusted him and his allegiance to his adopted country. Pharaoh has stood alongside Joseph, who, I might add, is a migrant and a former convict. In good times and in bad, he has invested in him and in his vision. He has given him an immense amount of power and wealth. He has listened to him cry. He is the one example who we can only hope to emulate, of a leader who in a time of global crisis threw his arms open wide to outsiders who were hungry and who welcomed them in. We would not be who we are had it not been for this welcome and the following chapter in Egypt. Israel would have perished and all of his descendants with him from starvation in their own land. And for practically every single person in this room tonight, online, from all corners of the globe, we would not be present here today had our ancestors not been welcomed home here in America. Friends, I must be honest and say that this is a very scary moment in which we are not sure what our next step is meant to be. If you have the personal ability to act as a sponsor for another Afghan Seeds of Peace alum, or if you can financially support us in paying the sky-high cost of application fees for humanitarian parole, you can email sanctuary@cbst.org. If you turn to page 6 in your program, and we're also sharing in the chat on live stream tonight, thank you, Sharon Golub, you will see a link to a letter you can sign being sent to President Biden and his Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Secretary Mayorkas is himself an American Jewish immigrant, a second-generation Holocaust survivor, and he had announced in August that Afghan nationals vetted on a case-by-case basis would be extended humanitarian parole, which is why, despite the ever-growing odds stacked against us, we have been advised to continue the process of application, as it is currently the only realistic option for Shapur, for his family, and for tens of thousands of Afghans in the same position. A famine is coming to Afghanistan, both literal and figurative. And what I am begging for us to take away from Parshat Vayigash, this Human Rights Shabbat, is an imperative to draw close. Even though this story can seem so far away, we must draw closer to the values this ancient story directs us. A radical welcome of the stranger, a reaffirmation to do the next right thing that will draw us closer to God's destiny, to save life and to hold it precious. We must draw closer to the hurt that is happening on the other side of the world, because it is the same hurt that we have experienced in our own stories, whether personal or communal. Nach besad rachenu v'nach korach v'nashuva ad Adonai. Let us examine the paths we take and let them return us to God. On this anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, let us, as an LGBTQ synagogue, a Jewish community who know the pain of the stranger and the immigrant in our bones and in our souls, open up the space to align our hearts to relieving the suffering of the stranger, whose stories we know so well because they are our own. Page 3 in your program.
Adonai.